Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got Reed Little back to the channel. How are you, Reed?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thanks as always for the invite. Looking forward to this chat.
Absolutely. As part of the continuing Deep Purple family series, we are going to do a show on the album that featured the first singer of Deep Purple, Rod Evans, Mark 1, and the album is Captain Beyond. So the self-titled from 1972. As always, we do a deep dive on each of the tracks, talk about the performances, the songs, and give us a little bit of a synopsis of what we think about this album with 2024 is. So, Reed, as always, I like to ask the question, what was your first encounter with Captain Beyond?
Well, actually, that's not too tough for me because it was very recently. I've only been a hardcore Deep Purple fan for about 10 years. And even then, I started it in rock. And I only got the first three Deep Purple albums, I think 2 years ago. So I didn't know Captain Beyond existed until I was watching a video from former Dio guitarist Rowan Robertson. And he mentioned that Captain Beyond was a favorite album of his and talked a little bit about it. And I was like, what? The first singer of Deep Purple's on a space rock album? Well, I got to check that out. So I bought it. And sure enough, it's very interesting.
Well, I think I've got a similar experience to you, Reed. Only sort of in my experience with Captain Beyond has only been the last couple of years, and it's through, YouTube shows and reviews, and, I really didn't sort of know it existed. So, and picked it up at a record fair. It's a very sort of well-beaten, sort of used album. It's not an album that I've seen in the wild that often. In these parts, and been playing it in fairly high rotation ever since. So a little bit of admin, we'll talk about Captain Beyond. This album came out in 1972, and it's a little bit of a super group as such. So you've got Rod Evans, who's this ex-singer from Deep Purple Mark 1, Lee Dorman on bass, Iron Butterfly, ex-Iron Butterfly, Larry Reinhardt on guitars, Iron Butterfly, and on the drums, Bobby Caldwell from Johnny Winter. So why don't we have a bit of a deep dive on the songs without further ado, and we'll talk about the first song on the side one, which is Dancing Madly Backwards. What do you think of this song, Reed?
Well, one, I think it's probably the best song on the album. So putting it first is an attention getter. It's the only song that somebody who is a casual Deep Purple fan might have encountered. I knew as soon as it started playing, I went, wait, I've heard this song before. Although I don't know where or when. There have been numerous bands that have done covers. And I think it's more likely that I heard one of the covers than that I heard the original song. But it's very distinctive. And it really encapsulates everything that's good and bad about Captain Beyond. And I'm sure we'll cover little bits and pieces of that as we go through the songs, and we can get kind of more general at the end. But right from the opening, sorry, some days my hair just gets in my mouth. Right from the opening, that drum beat that it starts off with is very non-rock. It's very syncopated. It's very kind of jazz fusion. The guitar and bass, they're actually doing a 1-4-5 progression, which is like a standard blues progression, but there's so much movement. It's almost like Rhino is playing a walking bass line with guitar chords behind each of the changes. And then the vocal line is actually quite simple, but augmented with these echoes and the space reverb and so stylistically it is all over the place. It's a very busy song, but it's really well written. It's got great lyrics. Rod Evans sings great on it. I think he sounds great on this whole album. And you would think this was at least a 2 or 3 guitar player band, because Rhino has so many different guitar part layers over the top of it. But the one thing that I notice each and every time I listen to it is at about 2 minutes, it sounds exactly like Black Sabbath's Megalomania. But Megalomania didn't come out for another 3 years.
So they're off the hooks.
Yes, but I cannot listen to that song without thinking this sounds like Mega. Dun, 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 dun. There's even a part where Larry goes, dun, 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 and which is kind of a Tony signature thing. So it's so weird to be listening to this album from 3 years before Sabotage, and suddenly there's this part that sounds just like future Black Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, there's been a few folk. I've read a lot of social commentary about this album and reviews. A few folk says that this is like the bastard child of Purple meets Sabbath. So that's an interesting viewpoint. This song, I think it's a really fine opener. It's got that crisp snare kick, and then the guitar riffs just keep coming. It's sort of like this whole album is very riff orientated, but they're kind of rolling riffs. And I can understand why this album gets gripped with stoner rock, because stoner rock is very repetitive riffs and they're always kind of rolling, and you've got all these augmented arrangements around it. Rod Evans' vocals are kind of process. I sort of said it was kind of like a megaphone. It's like this,
Yeah.
It's not the real Rod Evans' voice. It's slightly processed. So you're listening to something that's a little bit different. And I want to talk about Rod Evans' vocals, because that's something that I've been grappling with this whole album, and Rod Evans as the vocalist, because I think vocally he's more a crooner than a rocker, and he shows evidence on this album that he's trying to push from that crooner into more the rock space and push his vocals out into a different type of tonality. But getting back to this song, time signature change, it sounds very Sabbath-like, but cleaner guitar lines, less fuzz, and no down tuning. So I tend to agree with you, but there's so much Sabbath, the proggy Sabbath, and we've done some shows on Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, etc., on this album.
Right.
Armworth, which is a little palette cleanser at 1 minute 48, and that's another thing we're going to pick up on, Reed, because there's all these little interludes, isn't it? All connects, but there's all these little interludes in between. Like there's one track that we'll talk about that only just runs for 15 seconds, and you go, why? But anyway, Armworth, what do you think of this one?
All right. So generally, I think it's good. It's cleaner than Dancing Madly Backwards. So it's got a brighter tonality. There's less heaviness to the guitar, even though it's nearly that same Megalomania riff. And I'm sorry, I can't not think of it as the Megalomania riff, even if Captain Beyond did it first. I'm so much more familiar with Black Sabbath. To me, that will always be the Megalomania riff. But it is a very psychedelic song. And this starts to get into, I think, depending on your point of view, this is either the biggest strength or the biggest weakness of the band, is that there are a lot of stylistic elements in every song. It's hard rock, it's prog rock, it's space rock. There are parts of it that I swear sound like American Southern rock, even though Southern rock wasn't a thing yet. There's ambient music, even though ambient music was not a thing yet. So, but there's also huge slices of psychedelic. And on this song, you get a lot of that psychedelic music brought into it. And when I was listening to it, I can really picture like this band is the house band on something like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, where they're on stage, they've got Nehru jackets and sunglasses, and there's painted women fruging on either side of them, and there's just like a hippie rave out down on the dance floor. That's what it reminds me of, with this kind of early 70s space rock as well.
Yeah, and it also goes into jazz, it also goes into Latin. You can hear a lot of different it's a smorgasbord of influences. Do you find that the drumming is a little busy? Because look, the drumming's fantastic. That's the thing that's kind of the most noticeable, pops out to me when I've listened to this album in a short space of time ahead of this show. Do you think it's a little too busy?
Very song dependent, because even the longer songs, and one thing I really like about this album is even though it's proggy, there's only one song that's barely over 4 minutes. It is a short album. It's only just over 37 minutes long. It does not overstay its welcome. They're not doing 6 or 7 minute keyboard solos. There's no real long digressions. So when they do their changes are like 45 seconds, and then they change to something new. So there's always something new coming around the corner. But
really quick.
There are some songs, and we'll get into that. The next, I should say, apparently this album was conceived of as 3 suites of songs, like long medleys of songs. So between song 1 and 2, there's no pause. And between song 2 and 3, there's no pause. Where you really notice the change is in the drumming. So he's an incredibly versatile drummer, laying down all of these different beats, because it's no longer that super syncopated jazz fusion drumming that he had on the first track. In fact, it's a very simple rock beat on this track, and then he goes to a completely different style on the next song. So some of the songs I think are very busy, but some of them he really kind of underplays. So, fair play to him. And the drums are way up in the mix.
They are. They're very much up in the mix, and the guitars are. And I think Evan's vocals are actually pushed down, and that may be to the detriment. I would have liked Evan's vocals to be pushed a little bit further up. Armworth, it's a little jazzy. It swings. It's got the tambourine.
So much tambourine.
Yeah, and that gives the illusion that there's groove. The song is actually swinging. It's exploring some more dynamics. It's wrapped around a simple riff, and then you've got that wonderful spacey outro. So We go to Myopic Void. What do you think of this song?
Well, I think it's interesting when Myopic Void comes in, because again, it's the guitar. It's the drum that tells you that they've changed songs, and in this case, the drum slams on the brakes, going from this psychedelic rock beat to a very simple, like military march style beat, that then holds on for the entire song, because the guitar, which he's now playing slide, but with a lot of echo and a lot of reverb. And again, basically he's playing ambient guitar, even though no one even used the word ambient music until Brian Eno put out Ambient Volume 1, and that was in 1978. So this is 5 years ahead of that, but he's already making those kinds of sounds. And this is what I think people just would refer to as space rock at the time, because it sounded kind of trippy, kind of sci-fi. But towards the end of the song, it picks up the speed again, and it feels like the ending of a Broadway show, like Jesus Christ Superstar or something like that, to where it really is like a late 60s, early 70s kind of show tune. And I don't mean that derogatorily. It's just that this suite of songs starts with this big, well, again, it's only 4 minutes, but it sounds very epic. And then you have this very much smaller song, and then you have kind of a mid-paced song that's very spacey and ethereal. So 3 completely different feels, but even within the songs, there's usually 2 or 3 different feels in each song. So that is a lot of change over, less than 9 minutes. Actually, I think it's less than 8 minutes, all 3 of those tracks put together. So,
yeah, I think this song is very psyche. It's got lots of spacey guitar effects. And I think what you're referring to is towards the end of the song, there's like this double tracking harmonies, and it's kind of like birds, the bird-like harmony, and it swells to a bit of a crescendo. This album's got so many time signature changes. So it'd be as a first listen, I remember when I first heard this, it was sort of taking me in all these different directions. I was somewhat puzzled to think, what classification would you put this album under? Because it covers so many different areas. But it's as far away, first song withstanding, Reed. It's so far away from Deep Purple, and especially what they were doing in 1972. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think if you were going to compare them to anybody, it would be Iron Butterfly with just hints of Hawkwind and possibly Trapeze.
Iron Butterfly side 2. The side 2 of that first album is definitely very much the template of this album, I think.
All right. Although, interestingly, Rhino did not play on that album. He was brought into the band after that. But one thing that you clearly hear, and we haven't gotten to the songs where we're just about to hit the song where this comes in, you clearly hear the Jimi Hendrix influence. There are a couple of songs where Rod Evans really is channeling Jimi Hendrix. He's, with Deep Purple, they covered at least one Hendrix tune. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. But Hendrix must have been a hero of his. He was a hero for every guitar player in the late 60s, early 70s. So there is that, what I interpret as Southern rock influence or Jimi Hendrix. Because again, Rhino also, it turns out, I found this out after listening to the album, but he was from Florida and actually played in a bar band with Dickie Betts of the Allman Brothers Band.
Just the aesthetics, let's cover it off. What do you think of the album cover? I don't rate it that highly. I think
I love
like it. No,
yeah.
No. Yeah. And this, pardon the worn out cover, but this really, you can tell this is a space rock band or a psych band.
Right. Well, but if you look at the front again, the way that they've got the name Captain Beyond, it looks like it's in light bulbs. So again, you can see that as like the marquee of an off-Broadway show. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be in Australia, but a lower rent musical play someplace. So I think that's the vibe that they put out.
Yeah, I look at the hands. They're out of proportion to the head. It's just weird.
It's not a great.
No, yeah.
You know who it reminds me of? Uli Roth. That the picture of the guy on the front there, he reminds me of Uli Roth when he was in the Scorpions.
Yeah. Like 1972 was around the peak of prog. There were a lot of things happening. ELP, yes, all those sorts of band. To me, this sounds like a throwback to the late 60s. It doesn't sound 1970. Look, there is some 1972-isms in there. Just make that word up. But to me, it sounds more retro in 1972. Is that a fair take?
Yes, but I think it's one of their things. And again, I think this is, in 2024, it's easier to accept it as being a positive because, what's in 2024, what's the difference between 1968 and 1972? I mean, they might as well be the same year, right? But in 1968 was a lifetime ago in terms of music. The entire Haight-Ashbury movement has already been there and died. Hippies are gone. Hard rock and heavy metal have taken over in England. You've had progressive rock. You've had jazz fusion. It's just a completely different musical world. And these guys took all of those things and put them into one band. It's too many influences, but they've still got one foot very firmly planted in 1968. So I think they have, for some people that's going to be great, but I bet at the time people were going, some of this sounds old and tired, and some of this is just too much.
All right, well, let's go to the next song, Mesmerization, Eclipse. What do you think of this one?
This is one that I say sounds kind of like Southern rock. Starts with a great guitar riff. It's another real heavy one. It's not, songs 4 and 5 are not part of the 3 suites of songs on the album, so they're independent. But you've really got Evans. This is the first one where I think he really is trying to sing like Jimi Hendrix. And those guitars are great proto-Southern rock. Remember, Lynyrd Skynyrd's first album comes out in 1973. And those guys are from that Florida music scene. So they're from the same place that Rhino was doing his journeyman years before he joined Iron Butterfly. And I actually think that this is a song that Deep Purple could have done, because it's very riffy. It's very upbeat and kind of aggressive sounding. And then towards the end of the song, because it's not Deep Purple, it's Captain Beyond, you drift off into this psychedelic diversion again. So it's going along like, early heavy metal, and then all of a sudden it's psych. And it's psych for a minute, and then it finishes off with more rock. And I don't think that they're always completely successful in marrying those things up. But I do generally think it's a good song.
I'd like Rod Evans' vocals to be a bit more up in the mix on this one. I think that he's just a notch below the guitars. So I think his vocals are a little bit low in the mix. Rock riff's nice. Evans did the lyrics. So very much of its time, Reed. There's a bit of a Latin feel, a bit of Santana. That's a band we haven't mentioned. There's a bit of Santana in this. Gee, you've mentioned Southern rock. There's Latin, there's Santana. It's got everything but the kitchen sink. Caldwell's drumming is powerhouse. It's a drumming masterclass on this. So powerful. He really drives this song along. So then we go to Raging River of Fear.
Yeah, I think it's... So I didn't pay a ton of attention to the lyrics on this album, mostly in Dancing Madly Backwards, but there's a lot of vocal repetition, a lot of, by which I mean he just repeats the same lines, but Rod Evans does a lot of oohs and ahs, and they always double or triple or quadruple track those. Looking at the credits, it doesn't look like there's anybody else really singing. Rod Evans is doing both the lead and backup vocals. And the way they sequence those makes them sound very 1960s to me. Whereas Yes was doing very similar things with John Anderson, but I think it didn't have that same tonality. So, I don't listen to Yes and think, well, this sounds like the late 60s. Whereas there are several things in Captain Beyond that I think, because of the way the vocals are treated, still sounds like the late 60s. But I like Raging River of Fear. I think for a standalone song, it's probably my second favorite on the album. I think it's got a great riff. The drumming is very groovy. Again, harmony vocals. I've always loved harmony vocals. I prefer it when it's more than one person. Instead of just Rod Evans harmonizing with himself, I would like to hear a different voice. But you take what you can get. And then towards the end, again, because it's Captain Beyond, it drifts off into a psychedelic rave up. And I don't think that that's entirely successful. I think that they could have done, maybe have composed the pieces of the track a little bit better. But generally, I think it's a pretty strong song.
Yeah, I agree. It's a strong song. It's got the guitar has got a little bit of reverb, a bit of echo all the way through. It's got this, again, a rolling stoner riff. And yeah, there's this bit in, I think, midway through the song where the vocals turn into some sort of hyperventilate chorus. Lots of time signature changes, and the drum fills between the notes. They're kind of breakneck. The drumming is really, I think the word I would describe as fierce. He's really going for it. This is interesting in a way because the song becomes more unconventional as it goes along. It starts off very conventional and it just goes in all these different directions as it progresses. So again, I like this. It's a really strong song. Then we go into another little interlude, 1,000 Days of Yesterday, which only, I think it lasts a short time. What do you think of this song?
As sequenced and giving it its own track number and name, I think it's completely pointless. It's too short. It's too blasé. if they had just tacked it on as the opening part of the next song, which the next song even includes the repeated use of the line "1,000 Days of Yesterdays." So, the title says it's the intro, and fine, but this is really where the first time where I'm like, oh, just killed the momentum there. And then they have to pick it up with the next song.
Counterpoint. Maybe the album's going too fast and it needs to slow down. Because I was thinking on the positive and negatives when I'm sort of doing the balance sheet of this album. The negative is some of the sequencing puts too many breakneck songs and you need to sort of catch up and get your breath back. So maybe the purpose of this song, I know you don't groove on it, is just to just have a breath. I know it's one I say in a lot of albums when I do my shows, palate cleanser. Maybe it's the palate cleanser that you need before it goes back into the suite. So this is kind of like a rolling, there's a riff here, but it's a rolling acoustic riff and you've got the bird-like harmonies, just needs to calm things down because prior to that, it may be just too breakneck, just needs to settle. Frozen Over. Sabbath.
I like Frozen
Zeppelin.
Over. Yes. So it is Sabbath-esque, Sabbatherian maybe. But again, this is another song where I hear a lot of Southern rock and I hear a lot of Jimi Hendrix. In fact, I can imagine this track as like a Blackfoot song. Although Blackfoot was never this proggy. There are a lot of pieces. This song is under 4 minutes long, and there are so many changes and so many little pieces, that is one thing about Captain Beyond. I frequently find myself saying, I wish they would stick with a style a little longer. Because it's just about the time you're getting used to how something sounds, they're moving on to the next sound. And they don't stick with one style very often. And I'm sure that that's what they were trying to do. And if so, job accomplished. But it does make it, one, it's challenging to listen to. And two, I wouldn't say that this is an album for casual listeners. You can put on Lynyrd Skynyrd and just let it run in the background. And casual listeners will be okay with that, presuming they like Southern rock. But this album, I think, demands a little bit more attention. Otherwise, there are so many changes. I will say there's so much repetition in the lyrics on this one. It kind of bugs me that he just repeats the same thing so many times.
Yeah. Rod Evans' vocals. I've always found his vocal style a bit beige, especially in Purple. If I had to rank the Purple vocalists, he'd probably be ranked at the bottom because, I don't know, I think he's more of a crooner. I don't think he really fitted the style of music that Purple were leading into. Purple, in those first couple of albums, was psych, proto-metal, but they were leading into something that was heavier. And you can understand with Led Zeppelin 1 coming out, and Richie wanting something more pyrotechnic, he needed a vocalist that was kind of going to hit the mark and be very striking. And he hit pot gold with Ian Gillan. But Rod Evans, to me, is a vocalist. You listen to the song, but you can't really sort of remember. It doesn't really stick in your head. His vocals, to me, they're come across as quite beige. In this album, I can at least see him trying to get out of crooner into rock mode and push it and be a little bit growly, even though sometimes you think that he may be a little bit uncomfortable, like putting on that shirt that's a little tight or the pants that don't quite fit, but at least he's trying. And I think in this track, it's probably one of the most aggressive vocal performances where he's really trying to push it and come out of that rock crooner mode. What do you think of my comment about him being beige? Did you like Rod Evans in Purple?
Well, yes and no. One, I'm not overly fond of that entire style that they did on the first three albums. They're mostly fine, but I also read that Rod actually got the gig with Deep Purple because he brought to them the idea of doing Help as a ballad. And I consider that the worst song that Deep Purple ever recorded. And it's a complete travesty. So I will always have it against him for that. But other than that, he's okay. I think when you say he's trying to sound more rock, like I said, to me, very clearly, he goes to Jimi Hendrix. If he's not just singing like he is, and he does not have a massive range. I mean, he does some falsetto ooze and that kind of thing as background.
Yeah, but it's very narrow.
When he's pushing it, he is clearly trying to sing like Jimi Hendrix.
Rod Evans with the Jimi Hendrix is his vocal lines are matching the riff, aren't they? He's not going off on a tangent. He's just singing the riff. All right. I don't mind this song. I like it. Frozen Over. 1,000 Days of Yesterday. What do you think of this one?
Well, I like that it's a complete song, although they do something to irritate me right off the bat by bringing in the song before the last song has actually finished. So that there's just like a second or a second and a half where you've got the two competing songs going at the same time, and that bugs me. I would like a much cleaner transition. But once they do that, we're back in hard rock, we're back in progressive rock, until you get to the doo-wop harmony vocals again. And this is where, when you talk about Evans being a crooner, I think this is his safe zone. He's in this hard rock song, but he's going to bring in this vocal from the 60s. And that style of vocal, I don't think was very popular in British music. I think that was really more of an American thing with the Detroit bands and that sort of thing, Motown. And I think Evans is kind of delivering a British person's impression of what that singing would be like in 1972. Because he moved to the States, but he clearly, he grew up in wherever he was from in the UK. Didn't really look, but he was an outsider is what I'm saying. I think he has an outsider's delivery of that material, but he does it a lot on the album, so he's clearly very comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well, it's an unusual vocal line right in the middle where it goes all singing in the round, this counterpoint and the vocal harmonies, and it's like singing in a round, and you're thinking, wow, what sort of a song I'm listening to now? It's stylistically a little bit jarring. This becomes more jazzy and progressive as it goes along, and this is what I've found with a lot of these songs. As the song goes along, it changes. It becomes more unconventional, and they're throwing different stylistic choices. And I suspect that a lot of these songs were jammed in the studio and then evolved into songs because it has that sort of feel. It doesn't feel like this is a song that has been worked on, demoed outside and brought into the studio. What do you think?
I don't know. I think, obviously anything's possible, but I think what goes against that, if I were going to argue against it, is the sheer number of overdubs that they do. So they may very well have come up with their arrangements in a jammy fashion, but then they had to go in and layer vocals and layer guitars on guitars on guitars. And all of those things are very structured and would have to be done in a very methodical manner. So, I don't think it's necessarily has to be one or the other. It's probably a mix of both. And we don't know how much money we don't know how much money they had to make the record. It's a lot more expensive to write in the studio.
I Can't Feel Nothing, Part 1.
So I like this track. I think it's a pretty simple track, so I don't have a lot of detailed things. But again, this is, to me, the most Hendrixy of the Hendrixy songs. Rhino is playing very Hendrixy style guitar. Rod Evans is singing like Jimi Hendrix. And it's like most of their part ones or intros, it's a pretty short song, but I like it. It could also, I guess it could be like Cream, maybe one of the heavier Cream songs. But again, we're looking backwards, which is why I think starting your album with a song called Dancing Madly Backwards and then having so much 1968 on your album is kind of interesting. But I think it's generally a good song, but it's not super memorable.
There's a lot of groove, and Evans does sing the melody of the guitar line, so I can see what you're referencing, Jimi Hendrix. It's kind of a little bluesy, so there's another element to the song. I think it's a very dynamic song. As the moon speaks to the waves of the sea. It's a bit of a mood piece. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, this is another. I think if we think of Captain Beyond in prog music terms, and certainly while they have prog elements, I think people argue against them being prog because there's not enough keyboards and they don't have long enough songs and blah, blah, blah. The other day, my wife asked me, what is prog anyway? This is when we were seeing Yes in concert. She's like, what is prog anyway? I was like, I don't know. I don't know what the definition of it is. But to me, their music would be more in line with early Yes. And this is, especially on these spacier tracks, like there's so much space rock in this. And I can picture Peter Gabriel in a shiny silver lame jumpsuit, or maybe Ziggy Stardust era David Bowie. You know, any of those costumes for the singer, like Rod Evans wearing those on stage, would just fit perfectly. But what really jumps out in this is, again, a percussion break. And not just drumming this time, because there's like some bongos and timbala, and I'm not a percussion person, so I don't know the names of all the instruments, but it goes into what in the 80s we would start to call world music, but there wasn't really a name for it as a genre in the early 70s. So again, Captain Beyond ahead of their time. Or you can also think of it as a 1950s, like late 50s, early 60s kind of beatnik beat. Kind of picture people sitting in the nightclub snapping their fingers instead of clapping and wearing berets. So even though it's futuristic, there's a lot of retro to it as well.
Heap of retro.
That makes it, I think, a pretty interesting song, except for the lyrics. I think that when Rod does like trippy, spaced out lyrics, they're just not particularly wonderful.
Yeah, I think they're
I don't hate them, but
I think they're like Freak Me Out, Man. They're a little bit dated, and when he does that spoken word, to me, it's a little cringy.
Yeah,
and definitely carbon dates this album beyond, pardon the pun, 1972 back to 1968 or 67 in the Summer of Love. So you've got to understand that Rod Evans did hit a little bit of success with Deep Purple, with Hush in that first album.
right.
Deep Purple could barely get arrested in the UK, but Hush was a top 5 hit. And that album did reasonably well in America. And a lot of that album was Psych. And I like that album a lot. But he obviously is bringing to the table thinking, that kind of worked for me. I've got a name for myself. I'll bring a little bit of that influence, that Psych, into this album. And he's ramped it up considerably. It's got a nice rock riff in this one. There's a little bit of Blitzkrieg overdrive. I like the quieter moments on this album, and I think that the floor of this album, it needs more quieter moments. And it's a bit of a head scratch. I'm segueing into the next song, Reed, where you've got another track that comes straight after this one, Astral Lady, and it only goes for 16 seconds. And it's not even a palate cleanser. It's like a transitional rocker. Why?
Yeah, and it's so different. It's not like a continuation of the previous track or it's not like the track that follows it. It's 15 seconds of very different music, which really leaves you. It's just long enough to go, wait, what? And then the next song starts.
Yeah, and in the days of having an iPod and you have a mix, it'd be very disconcerting to have this 16 seconds of music come on and go, what the hell was that? You know, looking around.
Right. And
have you got much more to say about that one?
No, but except Wikipedia says that that's over a minute long. And I was like, what? No, it's not. It's 16 seconds. Who wrote this? This is why people be careful using Wikipedia as a source. No, it is not a source of quality information.
It is definitely 16 seconds. So, all right. As the Moon Speaks.
Pardon me. So, I like this song because we transition again to Captain Beyond featuring something that's not yet a style, because to me this sounds like space rock mixed with yacht rock. Yacht rock, again, a thing that would not exist for 5 years, right?
I'm getting my pen and pad out and just ticking all the genres. I think we've covered everything but reggae and ska.
Yeah, a little early for ska. Well, if they had done ska, that really would have been predicting the future. But yeah, it's I like As the Moon Speaks Return, but I can't get over that fact that I'm like, this is like space rock plus easy listening rock, which would be huge in America 5 years after this or 6 years after this.
Yeah, why do you say yacht rock? Because at 1 minute 48, and I actually clocked this in, it kind of goes Latin percussive. Bongos, you got the dry snare drum.
Right.
To me, that's like Santana territory, you know, when Santana does little, percussive interludes. I don't think
right. So there we're back in the world music again, or the Latin jazz fusion.
The jazz fusion, yeah. Are you a fan of jazz fusion?
Generally, no.
Yeah.
I think I like traditional jazz much better than jazz fusion, because a lot of jazz fusion is, and jazz fusion purists are going to hate this comment, but it's just endless soloing and not nearly enough melody to go along with it. Whereas I think traditional jazz, what ties traditional jazz together is the harmony that goes behind the improvisation. And jazz fusion does away with a lot of that harmony. It's just a rock beat, and then it's, you put some virtuoso to solo over it, and you're listening to somebody blow scales for 10 minutes, and I'm like, I'm done. Which isn't to say there's not some great fusion. There is great fusion. And fusion had only been a thing for a few years when this album was out. It was a very new genre. So, but it's not something I listen to very often. How about you?
Well, oh, no, I was just listening to you because I wanted to get the Read Little quote for the show, and I've just got it. So thank you. Thank you very much. No, I don't really like it that much. I don't know. I can't explain why. I know I like what I like, but yeah, it's not really one of my favorites. But all right, yeah. I Can't Feel Nothing, part 2.
So
basically a reprise. It's a reprise, isn't it?
It is, with dumbed down lyrics. There's a lot of oohs and ooh baby, and honestly, I think it's a Led Zeppelin pastiche. This time he's channeling Robert Plant's vocal mannerisms, because Robert Plant, I often joke that if you just walked up to Robert Plant and held a microphone up into him, he would go, "Ooh, me," just as a reflex. And I think that Rod Evans is just sort of doing that because that was what you did in 1972, but I don't think it particularly adds to the song. But again, it adds a new element to it. Now they're trying to be Led Zeppelin, which they haven't been on the rest of the album. But
I'm not sure about that. There was one song that I said was very Zepp-like, and that was Frozen Over. It had a kind of a Zepp. I could imagine Pagey possibly could play that riff, but anyway, that's just a little...
maybe. That whole last suite of songs to me sounds like it was made for a real trippy 1970s made-for-TV movie. And to anybody who's too young to remember what in America was the ABC movie of the week, for about 15 years, every week, ABC had a movie on Tuesday nights. And because they had so many movies that they had to do, they were of all kinds of weird genres, and they had animation and they had science fiction, and some of them were really way out there. A lot of them were just like, a guy cheating on his wife stories. Those were real popular in the 70s. But this last suite of songs to me sounds exactly like the soundtrack to one of the trippier 1970s made-for-TV movies.
Did they ever make a movie called Rod Evans' Diary of I Was the Original Deep Purple Singer?
No, but there are, is it The Point that has the soundtrack by Harry Nilsson?
Oh, there's so many. But it's fine. He's a little growly, the old Rod Evans. He's going rock star, and it's a reprise of the rock riff, which is a mighty fine rock riff. So it's sort of, it goes off on a high. I don't think it goes on a low point. I think it lands, it finishes where it sort of starts, goes off with a little bit of a pop. But, the record's over, and you look, you sort of take a deep breath, Reed, and you go, wow, what have I just listened to? And, even in this conversation, as I said, I've been joking, but there's just so many different stylistic changes, time signature changes, so many different genres. They're just throwing it all in the mix. And, stylistically, when you look at the players, Iron Butterfly, Deep Purple, Johnny Winter, they're kind of not that outside the wheelhouse. They're kind of adjacent to each other, aren't they?
Yeah, I think Johnny Winter's the real outlier here because there's so little blues, and what blues there is comes from the bass player. The drummer doesn't get anywhere near blues territory on this.
No,
he is
he's
all
really,
over the map in every other genre.
He's just putting fills. He's just driving along. And if I had to pick my MVP, I'd say he's my most valuable player. I think he's the star on this album. And it's simply by virtue or default of the production, the drums just pop out of the speakers. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going to go with Rhino, but that's just my guitar player bias showing. But yeah, the drumming is very interesting on the album, and I don't know of any other album in 1972 that had such a wide variety of interesting drumming on it. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating album. It's a real anomaly. I think that most bands that try to be too many things are not successful. That has plagued bands like King's X their whole career, where if people want to be able to put their bands into a small silo and say this is the thing that this band does. But it is a fascinating album. There's a lot of really good music on it. You have to have some tolerance for the various genres involved, but I would say anybody that was a fan of Jimi Hendrix or Cream or early Genesis or Yes, and even to an extent Deep Purple should absolutely check it out. It's a fascinating album. It's a bit of a hidden gem. I would give it a 7, probably 7 out of 10.
I'd give it a 7.5, so I'll give it half a mark higher than you. I think it's a fascinating album. I think the things that let it down is maybe too many stylistic changes, and it has a sort of schizophrenic, the schizophrenic approach may be a little bit jarring to some of the rock fans out there, but some really tasty riffs. The playing is fantastic. Rod Evans is going into some areas that you wouldn't have known or wouldn't see the evidence of with his first 3 albums with Deep Purple. But there's a lot to like. And as you said earlier in the show, it doesn't outstay its welcome. It's not a long album, which is, proggy. There's no long-winded solos. It just gets down to the business, and for most part, it's at a breakneck speed. So I give it a very solid 7.5.